everything is dead. The microbiology is dead, and the only thing that's alive out there is the grass. Today I wanted to talk to you more about this idea of, do we need fertilizers? Before I get too far into that, I apologize for the noise. It's actually quite nice. It's raining and you can just hear the rainfall, but it probably just sounds like static over the camera. But do we need chemical fertilizers? No, I would say no, and most grasses will be just fine without any assistance, honestly. They produce most of their own natural fertilizers. You certainly could seed the lawn with nitrogen fixers, but you sort of lose that monoculture, lush carpet of grass. You lose that look when you start, throwing clover and stuff into your grass, and the clover tends to kind of take over, especially in the springtime. All you see is just like white clover heads everywhere, and it's not the most appealing, but if you're willing to live through that and you do mow intensively, you can get very green grass by interseeding with clover. That's more of a pasture thing if you're like raising cows and so on. If you're on about an acre, you probably still want your yard to look like a yard. So clover is not an option, or some sort of nitrogen fixing plant that you can mow, an alfalfa or something, I suppose. If that's not an option, then your only option is to supplement your yard through fertilization. And you have a couple of options there. You can choose chemical fertilizers, which you can buy at your big box stores or your farm stores and so on. You can get something like a 30-010 or whatever that might be really good through the summer. Or the other option is you could use compost. So here's a couple of pros and cons. I figure we would just lay them all out there, and you can kind of decide for yourself. The first question I might have is, which one is going to allow me to build soil? Compost is going to be the winner in that one. Fertilizer doesn't build soil. It's just granules of minerals and NPK that's going to feed your grass somewhat artificially, but you're not necessarily going to build organic matter outside of the organic matter that you're pushing by feeding all of that nitrogen to your grass. And with some lawns, say if you have a Bermuda lawn or a tall fescue lawn, those guys just eat up the nitrogen, right? They love it. If you have what I've chosen for myself here, which is a Centipede Lawn, over-fertilization will kill your lawn. You really only need, per year, you only need about 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 on Centipede lawns, which is not a lot. It's a very, very low and slow feeder. And so just overwhelming it with nitrogen so that you can force it to grow, so that you can intensively mow that to build your soil, is not necessarily an option with Centipede, and not really an option for most grasses, because what you ultimately will end up with is not building soil, but building thatch. And the whole conversation of thatch, that's maybe for a different time, but for now, chemical fertilizers won't build your soil. Compost will aid in building that soil. Which one is easier to spread? That's probably a good question to ask. I would say chemical fertilizers take the win on this one, because you can buy a chemical sprayer or I'm sorry, you can buy a granule spreader. Dump your bag into that spreader and then just walk your yard with it and you're done. You don't need a lot of tools for it. You just need the spreader, which you can pick one up for not too much money. And you dump the bag, you walk your yard, and you're done. That's the end of it. With compost, you run into the problem of you kind of need a lot of it, right? You can't. A pickup truck load of compost is probably the equivalent of about one 50-pound bag of fertilizer, granule fertilizer. If you're talking about pound for pound of, nitrogen and how easy it is to spread and how much area you can cover and all of that kind of stuff, you're probably talking about a yard of compost to a bag of granule fertilizer. So in terms of ease of spreading, it's going to take a while to spread that stuff around, to spread that compost around. You got to fill up wheelbarrows, drag it all around the yard, rake it into the yard. You don't want to rake it or pile it too thick because then you'll smother the yard. There's definitely a lot more knowledge that's required, a lot more heavy lifting. It could be almost a day's work to spread compost if your yard is big enough and you have enough compost that you're going to have to spread around. On that note, which one travels better? Well, I'm going to have to give this one to the chemical fertilizers, right? You can go to your big box stores, your Home Depots and your Lowe's or Menards or whatever, and you can buy a couple of bags, 2, 3, 4 bags, put them in the trunk of a little sedan and bring those home. They take up almost no space because the nutrients are highly condensed into those granules. With compost, you have really two options with compost. You either have to call into a landscape supply place and order it by the yard, several yards of it, to have them dump it on your driveway, or dump it just in front of your house or something if you live on a quiet street or a cul-de-sac or something. And it's a little bit cumbersome, just the logistics of trying to find a place to keep this stuff and dump it, and just so that you can go spoon it out, one wheelbarrow at a time. There's kind of some logistical problems related to that, especially if you're like myself living off of a pretty busy road. They can't just dump it on the road. That would be a problem. DOT would be giving me a phone call. So it does not travel well. That's the one option, is to dump it. The other option is to go pick it up yourself, which if all you have is a family car, a sedan or something, you're not putting dirt in the back of your car. Not in the back seat, and certainly not in the trunk. You have to have, at a minimum, you have to have a pickup truck. And if you have a pickup truck, then you run into the weight problem. The most you can carry in mass and weight of compost is with your usual half-ton, three-quarter-ton truck, is 1 yard. 1 yard of compost. And if you don't know, 1 yard of compost is 1 cubic yard, which is 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. And it kind of sounds like a lot. And even when you look at it sitting in the back of your truck after they dump the stuff into your truck, it kind of looks like a lot. It goes pretty quick, A yard of compost doesn't go as far as you would like it to. So definitely I'm giving that win to chemical fertilizers. Okay, this one's a little nebulous, but measurable NPK. Right, if you don't know, NPK is your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium, and those are sort of the 3 pillars of getting your grass to look green and grow healthy and all of that good stuff. Those are the 3 numbers that you'll find on most of your chemical fertilizers, with nitrogen being really, as the lawn care nut would say, nitrogen drives the bus. right? Nitrogen is the one that you typically will focus on the most, especially during the summer. Whereas the potassium might be what you focus on in the fall before your grass goes to sleep. Which one of these has measurable NPK? Well, I'm going to give this win to chemical fertilizers because it's right on the label. There is no science involved there because the science is done for you. You figure out how many pounds you want to put in your yard, how many pounds per thousand, and then you buy however many bags you need to make that happen. With compost, you don't really know what you're getting, right? And I've bought compost from the same place multiple times, and the consistency of nutrients, the consistency of the texture of the compost has changed. And that's something that you have to be aware of, is that compost, especially if you're buying it and you're not making it yourself, the process of making that compost, it totally depends on where your provider is getting their materials from to make that compost. And so you do get inconsistent quality in terms of not just the texture of the compost, but the nutrients that are available in that compost. So chemical fertilizers take the win again. Okay, this is an interesting one because this whole time, up until now, we've been talking about feeding the grass. And this is, spoiler alert, this is maybe where compost is going to take the win, because if you're not talking about the grass and you're talking about the soil, then we have a completely different mindset of how we think about feeding the grass. Instead of feeding the grass, the NPK, the chemical fertilizers, what if we wanted to feed the soil, make the soil rich, and the soil feeds the grass? The things we put into our body, they reflect on us. If we eat nothing but junk food all the time, we're probably going to feel a little crappy and just be tore up from the floor up, right? If we eat healthy foods, we tend to feel a little lighter, a little healthier, a little more active, not so sluggish. We're not being drugged down by too many fats, too many sugars, and so on. And that's kind of the way that you're dealing with your grass as well when you're choosing compost over chemical fertilizers. Chemical fertilizers are much like steroids, right? You're injecting it right into your body, and it's making you feel strong, and you're building muscle quickly. And the problem is, what happens when you get off the steroids? You get saggy boobs, acne problems. You get all kinds of very strange side effects. Shrunken parts. Needless to say, it's not the best thing to be putting into your body. And that's the same way with chemical fertilizers. If we focus on just feeding the grass, the problem is that we do it at the sacrifice of everything else. So if you have a lawn that you've been feeding with heavy chemical fertilizers, and you suddenly stop it, give your grass 2 years and see what happens. It will be pale, nearly yellow, and you'll think, oh my gosh, I gotta start fertilizing again. And the reality is that, yeah, you probably do, because you have, at the expense of keeping your grass lush and green and looking alive, you've killed the soil that the grass is growing in. The medium, that dirt that is growing in, has effectively become inert. There's nothing there. There are no nutrients in the soil. All the worms are gone. Everything is dead. The microbiology is dead. And the only thing that's alive out there is the grass. And the only way that the grass is staying alive is because you keep pumping fertilizers onto it. So with compost, what you're really doing is, there is a little bit of urea and some nutrients that are in the compost just because they happen to be there from the process of making the compost. But what you're actually doing is feeding the soil. And so this is a different way of thinking about it, but when you put compost down, what you're actually doing is you're feeding the bugs, right? You're feeding the worms, the roly-polies, whatever insects happen to be creeping and crawling out in your yard. You're actually feeding them with your compost. You're not feeding the grass. But by feeding the worms are aerating your soil for you. They are pooping everywhere, so they're providing all of those NPKs for you by the process of them simply eating that compost and pooping wherever they lay, right? And so now you're getting free fertilizer for years to come when you lay a nice coat of compost. So while compost feeds the soil, chemical fertilizers kill the soil. I mean, think about it. Chemical fertilizers are mostly salt-based minerals that get ground up, and they balance them and put them into these nice and neat little granules that you can throw in the back of your car, come home, dump the bag into a spreader and walk your yard and go back inside in 15-20 minutes. They are designed for human efficiency and for ease of use. They're not really designed with nature in mind. So which one of these is going to have a positive multi-year impact? This is one where compost is going to take the win. Right, when you lay a nice thin layer of compost over your yard, again, you're feeding those worms are pooping, and they're not going to eat all of that compost in 1 year. They'll be back the next year and the next year, and as long as you see that nice thick black layer that is slowly forming over your yard when you simply move the grass out of the way a little bit, that is providing those nutrients to those worms, to those insects that ultimately provide your grass with the nutrients that it needs. It's a symbiotic relationship that does not exist through artificial means like chemical fertilizers. So the multi-year impact of chemical fertilizers is actually a negative effect, because the more and more nutrients that you dump out there, the less and less work anyone else would have to do to provide those nutrients. The worms don't have to be there, insects don't have to be there to provide nutrients to the grass. And so they may very well leave, because who wants to eat a bowl of salt? And that's basically what you're providing to those worms to eat. There's no organic matter out there outside of maybe some of the grass that you leave if you're mulching. And if you're bagging your grass, yeah, you're definitely having to put a lot of fertilizer down. And so keep that in mind, is that compost has a positive multi-year effect. Chemical fertilizers actually have a negative multi-year effect. Now, I'm not saying you're not going to kill your lawn by putting a bag or two out there from time to time. It's just that heavy, repeated application that is almost recommended by some people out in the industry, the professionals. I think if you laid back a little bit on the chemical fertilizers and eased your way into putting some compost down, you might be surprised by the results that you get. I will say one drawback, and this is something that chemical fertilizers will take the win on, is weeds. If you remember earlier, I mentioned the inconsistency of compost, and you're not really guaranteed to get the same quality every single time. Sometimes you may actually get weed seeds in that compost, and you could introduce weeds into your lawn by applying compost if it's not really good quality stuff. And so that's something that you'll also have to deal with, especially if you are newly seeding the lawn. You can't really apply any sort of pesticides or herbicides or anything like that to combat any problems that you may come across. You really have to just let it roll naturally, and with mowing being the only way of maintaining or managing those weeds, at least until everything gets established, and then you can reevaluate. You do not have that problem with chemical fertilizers, because it is only the fertilizers and mostly inert materials in that bag. Okay, so this video is running really long. Last thing I'm going to say is, well, maybe two things. Dollar per square foot. Let's compare dollar per square foot. If you are, let's flip that because it'll be a lot easier. The amount of square feet per dollar. How much land can you cover for a single dollar? If you look at your average bag of chemical fertilizers and you want to put down, say, about a pound or half a pound or so of nitrogen per 1,000, your average, say, $40 bag of chemical fertilizer, you're probably going to get about, I don't know, 300 square feet, 300, maybe 350 square feet of your yard per dollar of that fertilizer. That's about the economy of what you're dealing with. Let's say about 300 square feet per dollar. If you're talking about compost is really only going to give you somewhere between 60 and 70 square feet per dollar. So if that gives you a better idea of what we're talking about, you get a lot more land covered with that chemical fertilizer for roughly about the same price. You know, if you're comparing dollar per dollar, you're talking 60 to 70 square feet per dollar of compost, and you're talking about 3 to 350 square feet per dollar with chemical fertilizers. Because those granules are so high in nutrient, they're so tightly packed with nutrients, you can really cover a lot of ground with just 1 or 2 bags of that fertilizer. And that is, in some ways, really, if you're super conscious about the cost of right now, the immediate cost of just trying to get some green in your yard, chemical fertilizers are kind of the way to go. But again, remember that multi-year impact. If you continue to do that over and over and over again, you kill the soil and the soil becomes inert. In the long run, it ends up being more expensive over time because you become dependent on those chemical fertilizers. Whereas the other way around, if you build the soil, build organic matter, and then just let the worms and the bugs do the work for you, then you start to reap the benefits over a few years. Where I did the same treatment at my other house that I'm doing here, where I'm kind of laying thin layers of compost. And it got to the point in the last few years there where I didn't fertilize anymore. I just stopped using fertilizer. My grass, I had centipede grass, and my grass came in almost as bluegrass. And I didn't do anything to it. Year after year after year, it would just green up in the spring and look beautiful because the soil was so alive, it was so rich and thick. I could stick nearly up to my third knuckle. I could stick my finger into the ground, and it was just rich organic soil. And the grass loved it, and it never asked for anything. I never had yellowing problems or anything like that, but you know, it takes time to get that kind of organic matter in there. But once you do, grass becomes a little more pleasurable to deal with. And so that's really a decision that you have to make for yourself. Do you want the cheap, fast, easy alternative that you can put down quickly and go back in your house? Or do you want the solution that is going to take a lot of legwork to apply, a little bit of management over, say, 3 or 4 years of filling in the spots, the bald spots where the organic matter is not as rich, and giving that grass time to establish itself, so that then beyond that point, you kind of don't have to worry about it anymore. You get out there, you enjoy the mow, and that's about it most years. So that's a decision that you'll have to make for yourself. But here are some ideas that I have been thinking about, and some thoughts that I thought I would share with you. And I do hope you enjoyed this information, but I do have one last tip to tell you. If you do have a dog, be careful with the compost. I don't know what it is about compost, or maybe it's just my dog, but she loves compost, and I have to fight her to keep her away from it because I know that there is some danger of toxicity in compost, and I do not want her eating it, but man, she is, she is, I think, addicted. My dog has a problem. If you have any help centers that you know of that I could take my dog to, oh my gosh, that is a problem that you may have to deal with. I'm not sure what I can do about it, but if you have any suggestions on how to get your dog to leave your compost alone, drop them in the comments. Please let me know. I would say that's a big negative for me, but I'm not going to stop. I'm just going to keep trying to maybe teach her to leave it alone. Wish me luck, and with that, I'll see you on the next one.